Hello, all, and welcome to this virtual tour of Camp Hale, located near Leadville, Colorado. This was the site chosen by the United States military to train mountain soldiers in World War II. In the winter of 1939-1940, the Soviet Red Army invaded Finland with the intent of annexing it under their control. What followed became known as the Winter War, and it saw the Finnish army vastly outnumbered. They really had no chance whatsoever of winning, but they put up an incredible fight because they were used to fighting in the snow. They trained there and they understood mountain and snow warfare, to include the use of skis. Recognizing this, the United States military realized that they could train soldiers for great benefit in the war, and so they looked for a spot that they could do this in the United States and came up with what we see at Camp Hale. Located in Eagle Park, between Leadville and Red Cliff, Colorado. The size of Camp Hale during its time of use varied between 5,000 and over 250,000 acres that started on the valley floor, as you can see from the pictures, and rose up into the surrounding mountains, which soldiers used for training both skiing and shooting, mountain survival, and even artillery use, to include having a lot of pack mules that they brought in to help transport artillery gear. It was chosen, again, because of its elevation and because of its a massive amount of snow, which is also probably why they stopped using it eventually, because it was logistically a nightmare to get in and out of. Having been there, I can tell you that's very much the case. It's not an easy place to get to. Even from a place like Denver. And Denver is far removed from a lot of the centers of the Army, so supplying soldiers in a place like Camp Hale would have been extremely difficult. As you can see, again, from the pictures, the valley floor is quite expansive, allowing for hundreds of tents and structures and barracks to be created. Before they could start that, though, they had to clear out some, all these, like 5,000 acres worth of willows. So engineers came in and cleared out the area, and this was a pretty massive project, which also included rerouting the river. They actually straightened out the river, the Eagle River that flows through here. It used to wind and twist and turn, and they literally made the river straight. The construction itself started in 1942, and within 7 months and about $31 million later, the camp, which was named after a Spanish-American War veteran, not Civil War, Brigadier General Irving Hale, and the camp was named after. It received its first soldiers about 7 months after construction began, and they came via the railway line, which led right to camp. It was a brand new railway line that came off of another existing railway line leading through the mountains of Colorado. The Army's 87th Regiment began training there at Camp Hale under the direction of the Mountain Training Group, which included numerous notable Europeans who were Olympic athletes, who were world-renowned mountaineers, alpine climbers, and to include names like Andy Hennig, Floki Hammerl, and Torgor Tokel, names that I'm sure everyone's super familiar with today. But some names that you might recognize were members of the Von Trapp family were actually brought in to help train some of the soldiers here. Now, the Von Trapp family, as you may remember, was the family featured in the movie The Sound of Music. Those children grew up to be quite notable mountaineering experts and actually helped train some of the soldiers at Camp Hale in Colorado. There is, however, no indication that they actually taught songs to the soldiers, which I find highly disappointing. I was kind of hoping that they had various versions of So Long Farewell or something like that, but in Army cadence. Wouldn't that be fun? bad jokes aside, within a short period of time, the men who trained at Camp Hale actually became somewhat famous because the Army used this as a recruiting tool to get people, hey, come and learn how to ski and fight Nazis. What a great recruiting tool that turned out to be. Be a fighting mountaineer, some of the papers said. Well, when the soldiers became aware that they were receiving this kind of media attention, they got more and more daring with what they did in front of reporters or camera people, and to include rappelling down through the lobby of the Brown Palace Hotel in Denver. They literally drove pitons into the ceiling of the Brown Palace, one of the most notable famous hotels in Denver, and literally rappelled down through the center of the lobby, trying to probably impress some girls, and there may or may not have been alcohol involved. Let's go with may. As you can see from the comparative pictures, most of these structures have been torn down, but there are still some that remain. The field house, for example, still remains. But there's some remnants of the camp here, and it was actually used that when I was personally there. I was 12 years old in 1985, and the North American Pathfinders were here as, I believe it was called the Camporee, and some 16,000 Pathfinders descended upon this valley to have a giant camporee. I can imagine even soldiers would have been terrified by 16,000 teenagers, but that's just me. So again, there were extensive numbers of troops who trained here, and that it was a indication of the effectiveness of what they were doing, that these troops were able to go to places like northern Italy and fight very effectively. There's been a few books written about this. I'll include those at the end. And but again, it was only open for a few years. By 1945, the war was over, and there really wasn't a whole lot of point keeping this open, especially with the massive reduction in force during the drawdown period. You have to remember that we went from a fighting force in World War II, somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 million soldiers, down to around 1 million or 2 million soldiers within 2 years. So the drawdown was huge. The reduction in force was a massive one. 10th Mountain Division, which is the most famous division to come out of Camp Hale, went on to have a very notable career, and they're still fighting. They're still a very storied unit, and members of which I have personally served with and fought with and have enjoyed serving with, to include my own personal favorite drill sergeant who was actually killed in Afghanistan with the 10th Mountain Division. He was blown up by an IED. Point is, 10th Mountain Division still sees a lot of action, and it's still a very storied unit that got its start here at Camp Hale. There's a long history of battles that group has been a part of that is worth reading into if anyone is interested. Immediately following the war, Camp Hale was actually turned into a prisoner of war camp. That didn't last long either, probably because some soldiers escaped with a German, made it all the way to Mexico. I guess it was too easy to escape from. They couldn't keep people secure. At any rate, the POW camp didn't last long. A few years later, it was turned into a CIA camp, straight out of a movie, where they trained Tibetan freedom fighters in order to fight communist China in the mountains of Tibet. They figured that the surroundings at Camp Hale were very similar to the environment in Tibet, so they brought in several hundred Tibetan freedom fighters and trained them there in order to fight the communists. This was all part of the anti-communist campaign of the CIA, which was at times somewhat successful and at other times not so much. But that's a digression. I'll leave that to you. From 1974 through the 1980s, it became used for a lot of youth organizations, turned into, like I said, a camp out type spot, which is fascinating because in the 21st century, it has now been taken over by the Army Munitions Project with the purpose of removing unexploded ordnance. So that's kind of a fun, interesting fact. The munitions removal started well after it was a camp-out spot for kids. That should terrify you, but again, that's another digression. All of that, of course, brings you to the present, which brings us to a lovely campground that now exists here at Camp Hale, where you can pull up your RV and camp out for a while. Kind of a cool place. Leadville's not too far away, which is an interesting little mountain miner town, and you can go visit, and plenty of things to see and do. The altitude here is what gets a lot of people, so if you're here at 10,000 feet and you start feeling winded, that's what's called normal. There's not a lot of oxygen up here. So be aware of that, and I hope you enjoy your visit to Camp Hale on your virtual tour. You won't get out of breath because you're not here. Lucky you, because it's about to get really snowy up there, we hope, so that it can put out some of the fires that we've got. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it. You have a great day.